Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on your location. On behalf of the UNDP Seawee Water Governance Facility, the International Water Resources Association, IWLearn, UNESCO, and the government of Slovenia, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to day one of World Water Week, and in particular to this current session on governing groundwater, achieving the SDGs through accelerating inclusion and participation. As many of you know, an overarching objective of this year has been to draw attention to groundwater as a resource essential to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, including not only that of clean water and sanitation, but also poverty alleviation, food security, health and well-being, climate change adaptation, and more. So today's session is part of a broader effort by the panel organizers to highlight the role of people and institutions in preserving, protecting, and managing groundwater. Globally, groundwater supplies approximately half of the water withdrawn for domestic use and about 25% of all water used for irrigation. Groundwater is also important for water security, and that water stored in aquifers can be drawn upon during drought or dry periods when flows in rivers and streams are low or unavailable. And further, myriad plants and animals are dependent upon groundwater. But groundwater is also a limited resource, and excessive withdrawal of groundwater at rates exceeding recharge can have negative effects. People are essential to this equation. Not only do people drill wells and pump groundwater, but land use practices, ecosystems protection or destruction, and pollution management can all affect groundwater. Thus, even one person's actions can affect the availability and quality of the resource for all others. Hence, to ensure the sustainability of this precious resource, we need to consider not only the individual, but also the collective, and how everyone has an important role in the development of effective, accepted, and adaptable governance of the resource. So today's session is going to discuss how acceleration of inclusion, meaning the practice of providing equal access to opportunities, and participation, meaning the direct and indirect involvement of stakeholders in decision-making about policies, plans, and programs, are key building blocks for the governance of groundwater and thus for achieving the SDGs. We're going to begin with a short presentation by Jenny Gromwell in which she will define and explain participatory and inclusive groundwater governance, what it looks like, and why it's important. And after that, the session will transition to describing a series of real-world examples from participatory and inclusive groundwater governance. These examples will highlight differing groundwater challenges around the world and how involvement and consideration of stakeholders has been important for successful governance. More specifically, we will hear from Daoud Said about groundwater in Jordan, Elisa Blanco about groundwater in Chile, Elena Lopez-Gunn about groundwater recharge in Spain, and Amy Harburger about groundwater in Kenya. These cases will be followed by an interactive discussion and Q&A moderated by Michelle Frem from the UNESCO Groundwater Youth Network. And lastly, Alice Arieli from UNESCO IHP will summarize our session, highlighting key takeaway messages and drawing conclusions. Throughout, we invite you to share your comments and questions. To do so, you need to add them through the Pathables link, so through your web browser on Pathables, not through Zoom. So as a reminder, communicate through us through Pathables. Lastly, it's important to note that even though our session today is slated for only 80 minutes, it does not end here. Rather, this is the first of a series of events and programs through which the panel organizers seek to provide insights, examples, and guidance of groundwater governance for the sustainability and achievement of the SDGs. Other events will include activities at the COP27 Water Pavilion, at the UN Groundwater Summit, and at the UN 2023 Water Conference. All of us collaborating to produce this session today encourage you to connect with us at these future activities and to promote and share ideas about groundwater governance, as well as to join part of an emerging campaign to make both groundwater and those reliant and affected by it visible to all. So with that as our introduction, I would like to introduce and then pass our virtual microphone to our keynote speaker, Jenny Gromwell. Jenny is Seawee's advisor on water policy and rights with specialization in groundwater governance. She brings more than 20 years of experience and research interest in the self-supply and human rights-based approach to water governance. And Jenny was also the lead author on the World Water Development Report 2022's chapter on groundwater governance and policy.
Thank you so much, Anita. And let me see if I can share my screen. There we go. Can you see my screen now in presentation mode?
It is not in presentation mode.
Is it
There you
in presentation mode now?
You're in the wrong presentation mode.
No, I'm in the wrong. What about now? Can you see anything?
It's showing your notes.
It's showing my notes. It should really not be doing that.
If you press the three dots,
the three dots. Which three dots?
you put it on presentation mode. Then the three dots, the last option, you have a pencil below the three dots.
Hide presenter view.
Hide presenter view. Correct.
Okay, excellent. Very good. So now can you see my full screen?
Oh.
Now hit show screen again. If not, I can share their slides for you.
Yes, can you do that?
If you can get back to the screen you were just on, it would be under display settings.
There it goes.
That looks good also.
Now
I'm sharing them. Just tell me when to change.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. So thank you so much. Sorry for this disruption. I am very pleased to be giving the keynote presentation today. I will actually stop my video to save on CO2 emissions and electricity. So next slide, please, Anita. So let's start by looking at groundwater governance and management. Next, there are a number of principles that characterize good governance, which are also key from a human rights perspective, for the rights to safe drinking water and sanitation and the right to a healthy environment. So participation and inclusion are among those. Next. So we find that principle in this figure from a chapter in the 2022 World Water Development Report that mentions inclusive stakeholder participation. And those principles are prescriptive and future-looking, but to a large degree also binding on governments. However, if governance can be seen as part of the broader policy environment of a country, next, management occurs more often as a micro and meso level, and this can affect participation. Next. So the policy discourse on participation seeks to achieve not just any type of inclusion, but meaningful citizen participation. Next. The literature speaks of participation in public decision-making, which is here conceptualized by Einstein as a ladder with 8 rungs going upwards from non-participation to citizen empowerment and control. And this involves and depends on there being an enabling environment in which, for instance, access to information is provided for. Oftentimes, participation translates into voting for democratically elected representatives and providing arenas for dialogue with such persons and the public administration. More direct processes are also seen in certain contexts and regarding particular decisions. Next. But what does this mean for groundwater governance and for groundwater resources? At the formal level, we have the planning, policy, and lawmaking, and the allocation decisions, and the granting of drilling and extraction permits, as well as processes surrounding, for instance, a managed aquifer recharge project. And in the case such projects are of a certain scale or may have wider impacts, such as when a new well field is planned, the government would often be obliged under law to arrange for an environmental impact assessment and consult with those concerned. And in some jurisdictions, permit applicants can even opt for this type of process to safeguard their investments from future lawsuits. Next. However, research suggests that access to information and participation in decision-making are mostly employed in a reactive manner, but also that participatory decisions stand a better chance of being adhered to by permittees and result then in more effective relief for a given aquifer under stress, for instance, in comparison to top-down government-imposed decisions and restrictions. Next. Today, we talk about governance as being multi-level. Next. We also have a reality in which concerned government bodies and decision makers are mostly operating in silos. There is, in other words, not enough integration between entities. There is a diversity of actors with different degrees of influence, Next, from the international, regional, and domestic level down to the very local. And here we find an aspect of groundwater governance and management that makes this resource different from surface water. The existence of largely unknown but presumably very high number of end users with own wells or other access to groundwater. So we're talking about the individual household with an own well or a farmer, etc., and the communities as well as the private sector. So for instance, in India, which is the world's largest groundwater user, there are more than 20 million irrigation tube wells fitted with motorized pumps in the formal records alone. Next. So all those users, they take decisions on a daily basis that may impact directly on groundwater resources and aquifers, which may be shared with others or are needed for river-based flow, etc. And those users may not be experts enough to understand groundwater as a system, and they may not be aware of how their activities influence on others. But in some contexts, the local knowledge of, for instance, the groundwater flow and recharge patterns may be very accurate, and there are often unrealized opportunities here, where planners and decision makers should draw on this local knowledge and experience to improve characterization of groundwater flow, etc. Next. And here we can also note that Eleanor Ostrom's awarded a theory on how locally evolved institutional arrangements can successfully affect the resilience of the environment. And this theory was originally developed for shared groundwater resources. Next. Taken together, this means that groundwater is not like any other resource that we see around us, and there are inherent challenges to stakeholder involvement and participation, but also great opportunities. Next. First, as groundwater is a very local resource and often regarded as a private matter by landowners, again, primarily in India, this ensures that it is the end users who take operative decisions, but it also results in that effective regulation and top-down management is hard. Next. Another challenge has to do with the pervasive lack of data on this invisible resource that in turn prohibits access to information on groundwater and on particular features in a given context. Next. This is also linked to how intrinsic particularities of groundwater makes participation complex. For instance, if there is a limited consensus on the local or regional conditions, especially in a transboundary setting. Next. And it is furthermore difficult for governments to quantify, allocate, and regulate groundwater withdrawal and usage if their resources and institutional capacities are limited, including then their technical and hydrogeological competence. Next. Now, let's add the Sustainable Development Goals to this picture. Groundwater is of importance for the achievement of 53 SDG targets, most directly on the goal number 6. And the SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework that was decided by UN Water in 2020 recognizes that the targets under this goal go beyond provision of water supply, sanitation, and hygiene services to also include water scarcity, water pollution, biodiversity and ecosystem protection, disaster risk reduction, and leveraging water for peace. However, the latest progress report from 2021 on target 6.6, which sought to protect and restore water-related ecosystems by 2020, notes that global data on aquifer ecosystems are not available beyond modeling or ground-based measurements. Next. And fundamental here is also target 6B and the monitoring of stakeholder participation, which the WHO is the so-called custodian of. Next. In sum, if we look at how to accelerate action towards achievement of SDG 6 and its targets, some recommendations would be to, next, recognize groundwater as a local resource that is in practice managed by end users on a day-to-day basis and partially therefore challenging to regulate effectively top-down. Next. Decentralize much of the decision-making to government bodies at municipal or similar level, but recognize that oftentimes there are no formal institutions through which governance can extend. Next. See self-regulation, community awareness building, and participatory monitoring as complementary to governmental institutions and rules. Next. And finally, research point to the need to invest in learning communities for participatory monitoring, capacity building and education at and for local communities to enable them to move from data collection to systems understanding, co-produce and share knowledge, inform context-specific and climate change affected decision-making, and discuss with authorities in more equal ways. You will soon hear from our invited speakers on what participation can look like in groundwater governance and management in real life. But I'd also like to recommend next a session on Thursday on those very matters and which I have taken findings from. Next. And you can learn more about the SDG acceleration framework at the UN Groundwater Summit in December, which Anita mentioned. Thank you. And with that, let's hand over to Michel. So Michel is a water professional specialized in groundwater modeling and management. He's a civil engineer. He has a Master's of Science in Hydrology and Water Resources from IHE Delft. And Michel is a member of IAH and is currently the chair of the UNESCO Groundwater Youth Network. Over to you, Michel.
Hi, everyone. So thanks, Jenny, for introducing me, and thank you so much for sharing your broad experience with us. I was personally impressed by your speech, especially the part regarding the enabling environment and citizen participation for good groundwater governance. So as our session is mainly about groundwater governance and as a representative of youth-led networks, I would also like to highlight that youth are important stakeholders in groundwater governance and management, which is in line with the diversity of actors mentioned by Jenny's keynote. So youth are not only beneficiaries of existing policies, but they are also the change makers who need to ensure accessible, affordable, and safe water for all in the coming decades. As such, I invite and urge all institutions around the world to trust the capabilities of young people and to turn the spotlight on the power of youth in the sector. We at UNESCO Groundwater Youth Network will organize the Groundwater Youth Forum, which is a session at the Groundwater Summit, also mentioned by Anita and Jenny. And so we will discuss and promote youth engagement in groundwater governance as an essential tool for achieving water security and SDG 6. In brief, if decision or policymakers want to change a certain mindset and encourage innovation, it's most often to start with the youth, so obviously. And so here, our great audience, as you already know, I will be moderating this session. So I've tried to facilitate the interaction between you and our speakers. So allow me to directly start by thanking our speakers and the organizers for taking time to prepare for this event. So the speakers for this online session are by chronological order of presentations. Dawood Said from Straight Light Consultants, who will be presenting live from the field in Jordan about managed aquifer recharge in the Azraq Basin. Elisa Blanco from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, who will tell us more about her case study in Copiapo, Chile. Then we will move to Spain to hear more about co-managed aquifer recharge with Elena Lopez-Gunn from iCatalyst. And after that, Amy Hartberger from Texas Tech University School of Law will talk about managing groundwater for resilience in Kenya. And during the presentations, please make sure to put your question and comments as mentioned by Anita in the chat box of the Passable platform, not in the Zoom. And I will keep an eye there to raise your voice in the Q&A session that will take place after those 4 presentations. And after the Q&A, we will be having closing with Alice O'Leaf from UNESCO IHP. So we will start with the managed aquifer recharge case study from Jordan with Dawood Said, who is a hydrogeologist and environmental management expert having a long experience in farming efficiency and agricultural development. He organized and facilitated awareness sessions, workshops, and events. He conducted strategic, integrated, and master planning efforts and led community mobilization initiatives and many training of trainers. Dawood is author and translator of several technical reports and proposals. Dawood, it's our pleasure to have you. The floor is yours to give us an overview about your case study and how did your work and local knowledge contribute to enhancing groundwater recharge and mitigating the impacts of drought in your region. Dawood.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry it might be a little bit windy, but we're trying our best to do it as clear as possible. Actually, my name is Dawood. I have a PhD in environmental management. I worked most of my career in groundwater and surface water as a hydrologist. Basically, I'm from this area in Jordan, to the east of Jordan. It's called Azraq. Azraq is one of Ramsar area. If you ever heard about Ramsar Agreement, pumping decrease the water table where the oasis was dried, and then they as you see here, they most of it's very dry area. Jordan basically is located in an arid area, arid to semi-arid. That's less than 50 millimeter a year. We have also another problems, the pressure on the water, or basically in the groundwater, as it's the main resource for water in Jordan. According to the refugees waves along since 1948, and then Iraqis, and then we are talking about Syrians. So the pressure of refugees has increased the need for water. However, we're trying to get advantages in this in Azraq. We are trying to get advantages of the flooding water, which basically comes from the catchment area, a huge catchment area of Azraq, comes along by the managed aquifer, sorry, by the seasonal seasonal streams, like this one where we are standing over here. So we decided to adapt the natural-based solution in this project. Nature-based solution basically tries to simulate the environment and not affecting even the landscape. Here with this project was supported by UNDP, SIWI, UNRDAM, a lot of other organizations. We're trying to connect all of these organizations together between donors and NGOs to come up with the best results. And also because we believe in everybody has a contribution in the sustainability of water resources. We as well try to get the local government involved in such projects. And in this project, the municipality was it was the very first project where the municipality of Azraq get involved in such a project. While it's basically the Ministry of Water and Irrigation usually takes care of such projects. However, in 2018, with support of CV through Gold Water Program, UNDP Jordan, in cooperation with the Ministry of Water and Irrigation, carried out the drought vulnerability assessment in the 4 major renewable groundwater basins in Jordan. The study that the Azraq groundwater basin is extremely vulnerable to drought, and accordingly, the concerned stakeholders defined as set migration measures. The first priority was to enhance the artificial recharge, or what we call managed aquifer recharge. Managed aquifer recharge basically is trying to improve the capability of the groundwater to be recharged from wherever we have a clean water resource. This site, for example, what you see right here is a small let's say, hafir or a little air dam capture some of the water comes from the north of Jordan by this stream, go all the way to the mud flat. As you see, the mud flat is basically silt and clay. So, and it's dusty now. I don't know if you can see it clearly. We are trying to capture some of this water, not to affect as well the habitat of the migration bird and other wild animals. So we are not trying to keep all the water away from the mudflat, but parts of it we're trying to catch it in the managed aquifer recharge site and its capability to reach the groundwater, to recharge the groundwater. The monitoring program indicates that the infiltration has improved from 3% to approximately 45%. We still need monitoring over the coming 5 years to explore any other variables that might affect the filtration. The project has a big potential to be implemented not only in Jordan, not only in this side, in other countries or other areas in Jordan or the Middle East or wherever places have to this. We're hoping to establish a market of the managed aquifer recharge around 14 million a year.
Dawood, sorry, we can't hear you well. We can't hear you well, so it's very noisy. And if you can wrap up, so we still have like 1 minute or 2 maximum.
Okay. Okay, the last sentence I wanted to say that this project can be duplicated in other countries or in Jordan itself. And also we are hoping to establish implementing the rest of the rest places around Azraq to get around 14 million cubic meter a year from the groundwater as a charge to the groundwater. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dawood. Yeah, thank you so much for taking us to Jordan and this virtual field trip. So we're lucky to go to Jordan with you, like virtually at least. So as you mentioned, partnerships are very important for the success of such projects. And also MAR projects can play a crucial role in agricultural water management and such areas of the world, assuming that hydrogeological, financial, social, and also environmental conditions exist and are suitable. I also saw in the chat box a lot of attendants discussing the importance of local communities' participation in groundwater management and governance. So probably we can also discuss this more in the Q&A session. Thank you, Dawood. So now we move to Elisa Blanco, who will present the case of Copiapo in Chile. Elisa is a PhD candidate in natural resource economics at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. She is an agricultural economist with a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago and an Nuffield Scholar. She is specialized in water management, governance, and institutionality, in addition to the water, energy, and food nexus approach. Elisa, we are excited to hear about your case study for the next few minutes. So based on your experience, what mainly triggers collective groundwater management in Copiapo in Chile?
Well, the only thing I can tell you is that it's not a straightforward answer. And Anita, if you could help me with presenting. And yes, in this case, it's an interesting case because local water users were the ones who took advantage of these regulation voids that we have regarding groundwater to develop their own rules. They took that space to develop their own rules, you know? So the next slide, as a little bit of context, this is Chile, is a quite diverse scenario since it's the longest country in the world. And we've been having a drought so intense in terms of no precipitation and length that it's been called a mega drought. The case I'm going to talk about is located near the Atacama Desert, that not only is one of the most driest areas, but it's increasing over time. And the area I want to talk about is Copiapó. I think if you click the next one, it will show in a circle. There it is, with less than 28 millimeters a year, less than what Dawood was saying. And here, there's a lot of agriculture and mining activity taking place. So in the next slide, I'll tell you that as for many countries, our legislation regarding water resources was focused on solving the surface management issues first, almost forgetting about the groundwater particularities. And as you can imagine, in this scenario where the surface river stopped running years ago and the groundwater was the main source used, it led to a huge overallocation of groundwater use rights. And they were given in an account of around 5 times its capacity. So it led to the aquifer level dropping and having wells down to 200 meters in a 10-year difference from when they were down to 5 or to 15 meters. And also there was a lot of information gaps regarding how much water has been given, who had the water, and how the aquifer behaved. Together with the allocation and the information problems, management problem arise. We didn't know how to handle this hidden resource, how to monitor it, how to control its use. And of course, this led to conflict and trust issues. Next slide, please. In 2004, like almost 20 years ago almost, the government, not knowing what to do with them, they organized them as if they were an irrigation district. So they hired someone and the person walk around watching, doing some surveillance of the wells, but it was not really an active organization until in 2012, the situation was even more critical and they required support to actually make it work. And they hired us I was from the university with the university team, and they hired us to set up a local office and start gathering with them, asking what were their needs. And what we did is we started organizing or meeting with them first by sector, but by area, with farmers only, then only with the potable water services company, then with the mining representative and such. And after a while, we started gathering them, but in informative sessions about how the aquifer is doing and about climatic projections. But in that scenario, we brought everybody together. And in those meetings, even though they were mostly informative, we started identifying that they were providing with ideas, with answers, with management solutions regarding how to overcome, for example, the solid or the unmoving bureaucratical system. And an important part of these regular meetings ended up being that they identified that they had a lot of worries and problems that were aligned between each other. And what do you know? The trust building started happening between them. And in the next slide, please. Currently, the basin is fully organized into 5 groundwater users communities, each with a representative board, partially nested on the Surface Water Association. And most wells now have a monitoring device, and there's websites for the information, and it's pretty much working. So from the lessons, what I identified to be the key aspects here are first, the existence of a neutral and technical team that acted as mediators. It provided for a neutral space where all stakeholders could gather and could debate freely, Also, having a collective language and representation of all stakeholders, that all stakeholders were representative, were established formally in the legal documents was really relevant. For example, boards have reserved slots for small farmers to ensure they're representative in their discussions and in their decision-making process. And in those boards, each member has the same vote. So one member, one vote. So they have the same weight. Also, clearly identifying this, providing information and cross-checking it, we had to identify all members, their water rights, and we had to establish a consensus among them on this registry. Also, the creativity and openness to all ideas, we had to search and listen to solutions out of the box to achieve these strategies in a given strict and bureaucratical institutional framework. Here, the example is that even though we had to, this groundwater aquifers were divided in sub-basins, some sub-groundwater basins, and we, by law and by the bureaucratic institution, we had to have one organization for each sub-basin, even though they are connected and we wanted them to act as one. So what we did is that we established, together with the people, that it was their idea, we established the same own regulations for each organization, so they could easily act as one. They had the same norms, you know. And what happened is that so far it has happened. 3 of the upstream aquifers are acting as one, have the same board, the same people, almost the same people, but the same board. Also building trust, we had to be really consistent and transparent to promote this trust building. And finally, we did some monitoring planning that got support from the, like a private public agreement to partially fund it. So that was the, so that's almost it. Because I want to say that this is not a perfect example. There are still aspects that require solution in the Copiapó Basin. For example, we need to establish environmental securities. We still have some indigenous communities without water rights formally incorporated. However, in terms of the promotion and the development of collective action, this basin has been a success case study. And it's since most of these problems and barriers can be found in many other places, its lessons can be useful for other groundwater management all over the world. So that's it. Thank you very much. That's my email there in case you need it. And thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. So that was a great presentation, and you highlighted many complex groundwater management issues, and those are usually, as you mentioned, constrained by sometimes unfit or even missing regulations and legislations. So that's a problem in many parts of the world. And indeed, also many problems are very particular and need out-of-the-box solutions, as you also mentioned. And those solutions sometimes need to take into account multiple scenarios, also the user situation, the institutional and the financial context. And something also that caught my attention at the very end of your presentation was this idea of interflow between the different aquifers and the challenge they cause for managing groundwater and aquifers between the different organizations. So that was really impressive, and thank you again, Elisa. So now our third presentation will be with Elena Lopez-Gan. So Elena is the CEO of iCatalyst and lead author of Group 2 of the IPCC on adaptation. She is member of the Scientific Advisory Council on Climate Change of the European Union, president of the Brigade Connect Association on Innovation and Climate Change Adaptation, a collaborator with the Basque Center for Climate Change. She was an associate professor at the IE Business School and a researcher at the Water Observatory, the Botton Foundation, and the London School of Economics. She will present the concept of co-managed aquifer recharge with a case study from the Douro Basin in Spain. Elena, can you please tell us more about the lessons learned from this study? So,
okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and very nice to be part of this session, and particularly the previous case studies were very interesting. So I think my message is going to be similar. Start from the beginning, just basically the importance of inclusion when you're talking about groundwater management, because the huge number of actors involved, you know, you have to have them on your side. So with this, I'll try to share my screen. Okay, so, and I just realized that okay, so 1 second, just trying to, okay, it's okay now, yes? Can everyone see it okay?
Yeah.
yes.
Share is fine, no? Okay,
Yeah.
right. Okay, so well, just to say that, you know, my co-presenter, I think, is in the audience, so at some point, if he wants to chip in, he's welcome to. So what we're going to is basically a study where in Spain, probably a lot of you know that in some aquifers, we've now passed the limits. The aquifers are, you know, basically overexploited or well beyond their capacity to recharge. So one big development has been the development of this managed aquifer recharge. In a way, our message is that even when you move to measures that basically are trying to, in a way, recover the damage that has already been done, you still have to have the users on board. They are equally important as you move further along the recovery or restoration of aquifers, as much as the, you know, the development. So basically, our central message, and I want to stress, is that you really need to create a space for collaboration, which is based on the fair use of groundwater resources, but also that's why you also need to have a kind of strong functional organizational structures that support the allocation of increasingly scarce resources that help, you know, take decisions which have a direct positive outcomes on the improved groundwater quality and quantity. And I want to stress that in our case study, and I put the publication there because I have a very short time to present our case study. So if anyone wants to read it, it's one of the chapters in this book, which you can access online, produced by UNESCO for this year, which is especially on groundwater. And we want to stress that we're talking about groundwater quality and quantity, and both are increasingly kind of on the scene. And it's this idea of creating a kind of basis for new governance arrangements, a bit like Elisa was saying just before, which are better suited and more responsive for the collective interest of users as they change. And basically my central message is that in a way, it's this combination of, on the one hand, you have these hard structural measures, but in this case, it's managed aquifer recharge, which is very technical, and Enrique, who is my co-author, is one of the global experts on this area and very, very active. So if you have technical questions, I'll probably refer them to him. But also these soft non-structural measures. It's this, you know, as Elisa said, the creation of groundwater user communities. And this combination of these hard structural measures, in this case, are trying to address an aquifer that was basically on the down for a number of years. You still need to get them engaged. You have the hardware and the software. So you have, you know, the MA, and here we put, you know, as you can see, as was also presented from the case of Jordan, it's a complex project. It's a complex process where you have to have a risk assessment, the monitoring, and the control. You need to have also, you know, the maximum allowable concentration. You know, so you need to have all these, you know, technical process that needs to be followed properly. But then you also need to have an equal complex process, social process that needs to accompany this technical process for it to be truly successful. Otherwise, I actually think that the technical will not really be sustained into the future. It has to be really owned by the people that live locally. And just to confirm that, for example, in the development of the conceptual model, Enrique was telling me that in fact, they really did tap into local knowledge. For example, you know, where the springs were, where things, you know, where springs that had dried up, you know, where they should actually put their effort. So in a way, you know, the kind of local technical knowledge was also critical for the long-term success of the managed aquifer recharge system. And as you can see here, and I think this to me is probably one of the most important, or the most important slide for my presentation, because at the end of the day, with groundwater, we have to be talking about results. You know, we're talking about a resource that, as has been said this year, you know, is really under pressure. In a situation of climate change, I think it's going to become even more pressurized. And therefore, what you can see here is that thanks to this aquifer recharge, we actually do see an aquifer recovery. And this was partly, or very much also with the engagement from the onset of the project of all the kind of local stakeholders. And going back, I want to make a stress here that under climate change, when we will see more extreme rainfall events, I think managed aquifer recharge, if properly done, not to increase the area, for example, of irrigation, but rather to recover the areas that at the moment are unsustainable. So we start to recover this very precious resource that I think is going to be very, very important and a real ally into the future as we move into greater uncertainty, and where you need to, on the one hand, think of the physical space, the aquifers and how they have to be managed and the resources that they have, and not go beyond their limits. And in cases like we have, for example, in these areas in Spain where the limits have been breached, when you have to recover them. And I think in this case, managed aquifer recharge with the collaboration of stakeholders, I think is going to be a very useful kind of measure for going forward into the management of groundwater resources globally. And with that, I think that's my central case study. And I've put our contacts there. So if you have more questions, feel free to contact us so we can give you further feedback into this, this case study. And with that, that's our case study. Michelle.
Yes, thank you so much, Elena. So it was a real pleasure to hear about this combination of hard and soft infrastructure processes for our projects. I was usually involved in the hard infrastructure part during the past 4 or 5 years. So I really enjoyed and gained a lot of info from your presentation to become more familiar with the softer part. And this also, in my opinion, this is needed to also have success in the hard part. You need to be also aware of the softer part aspects. So thank you so much. And the last presentation of this session will be with Amy Harberger, and she will talk about managing groundwater for resilience in Kenya. Amy is a McCluskey Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Water Law and Policy at Texas Tech School of Law. Her work focuses on the intersection of water with other disciplines such as energy and land management. So it's our honor to have you with us, Amy, and the floor is yours to take us to Kenya in a brief 5 minutes.
I really wish I could do this one from the field also. That would be a much nicer place, but we'll just have to do it. We'll just have to imagine ourselves there. Let me just share this quickly. So in comparison to the other case studies that we just had, I think this one sort of pulls back a little bit and really focuses on how governance can be, shared governance can be embedded into the sort of legal system itself, looking at Kenya as a case study. And so, sort of framing the idea of what's happening in Kenya and other sub-Saharan African countries, and really, I think it's applicable even beyond that continent. But, there's often, for developed countries, when we think about groundwater and management, just like the presentation that we just saw, much of it is reactive. Much of the groundwater has already been developed. Many times it's been overdeveloped. And so a lot of the focus is really on trying to understand how we can change our use patterns or protect the aquifer itself. In contrast, in developing countries, often they haven't fully developed these groundwater resources, which actually provides an opportunity to think more on the front end of how they want those resources to develop or to be developed and what their long-term objectives and goals are. And so in that context, they can learn from some of the mistakes, or I don't want to say mistakes, but sort of missteps, or what it is that other developed countries have learned. So Kenya, in many ways, meets this nexus trilogy of where you have, conflict in the country from time to time, natural disasters or climate change exacerbating the strain on the resource, all sort of under this umbrella of an economically developing country. And so that can create a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop where the conflict or the economic development, if it's not happening effectively, can have a negative impact on the resources, but the reverse is also true. And obviously that's what we would aim for, is where that sort of the benefits can all be happening at the same time, and that minimizes conflict over time. In Kenya, there's a sort of a complex structure that looks at, that manages water across the country. The system is split between water supply, actually the physicality of getting water to the people, which of course is still a primary concern and quite important, with the policy arm as a parallel working hand in hand. And what's interesting about the sort of Kenyan governance system really starts from their 2010 constitution, which provides water as a human right, and goes on to explain that that's not just a national obligation, but that the counties actually have a heavy responsibility in ensuring that that actually happens. And so even in that structure, in the water delivery structure, we have this local governance involvement. Similarly, on the water planning side, so there was originally 2002 Water Act, there was an updated 2016 Water Act. And what the 2016 Water Act did is it mirrored that shared governance. So even within the system of where they talk about what the policies are going to be, the county level is involved, and the language of that expects that the county will go get sort of local buy-in, and sort of local involvement and participation. So these are all the kind of the different agencies, but I think that the left-hand column is what's sort of striking to me, particularly in light of Jenny's keynote presentation, is that there's this recognition that there's a water governance from a national level. The water in Kenya belongs to the government, but we now have this sort of regional and local anticipation of involvement in this development of water policy. Now, this is the broad water policy. It includes surface water as well. It's not tailored specifically to groundwater, but it certainly applies to groundwater. So, looking at what the role of participation can be when we move to these county areas when they're developing policy. So, oftentimes regulations really focus on measurement, monitoring, and management. But when you really have the involvement of local participation, where they can be part of coming up with locally tailored outcomes, it really broadens the scale of how a local government might define what they want for the future of that groundwater and what they think that it might be used for. So, considerations might include relationship between surface water and groundwater. It might include environmental users, or many areas of land of Kenya, the focus is really range management and land use, which is directly related to recharge and the relationship between surface water and groundwater. Of course, human rights is an issue that's in their constitution, and also the management of conflict. Okay, there we go. So, when we think about the challenges in areas like this, you can't forget that there's still a very large amount of the community that don't have access to water at all. So, we're developing water resources to try to meet the country's goal of ensuring that everybody has access to water, while there's still a parallel focus on managing that resource. So one of the big issues always for almost everyone around the world, but here also, is lack of data and aquifer understanding, so that as you're making these plans, you're working within the natural science of the system. There are still continuing threats of conflict in various parts of Kenya that come and go, that have to be considered. There are international shared groundwater in Kenya, and at the moment, no groundwater agreements for these. So that can also obviously create some issues if the country on the other side is managing it in a very different way. Kenya, like many sub-Saharan African countries, is experiencing very rapid population growth. So the pressure to sort of develop these water policies is is to do it quickly, which is hard with politics sometimes. And then, implementation challenges, we all share implementation challenges, but, to have it on paper, it has to be translated into the real world to really be effective. And lack of capacity is always an issue. Staffing, again, the science, ensuring that we have this information. But there's also some really unique opportunities in areas like these. One is, of course, the opportunity for Kenya specifically is that we do have this human right to water present. We have a legal framework that incorporates and obligates counties to go out and to come up with local participation and management to assist in this program. So you have this kind of iterative relationship between the national government and local governments. Kenya also has a national water master plan for 2030 that mirrors a lot of these very important goals that similar to what Jenny was talking about in our first presentation. And even though these are being handled in parallel, there's actually some amazing opportunities as you're developing water resources, and particularly in this sort of WASH focus with other organizations to actually assist in the policy piece, both in terms of data collection when these wells are being drilled, but also the policy can also work to guide where the WASH focus should be. Where is it that we should be developing these wells to be able to assist Kenyan citizens in getting the water available directly to them to get that supply of good, clean water in sufficient quantities. So developing nations have a unique opportunity to tailor their groundwater development and groundwater policy to meet shared regional outcomes. And that's it. That's all I have. If anybody has any questions, I know I think it's time to go to the chat, but if you ever want to contact me directly, here's my contact information. Michelle, back to you.
Thank you, Amy. So it was really insightful to hear about your experience regarding groundwater governance in Kenya. I can also relate to many aspects you mentioned, as I also focused on groundwater issues in South Kenya, so next to Tanzania also, in the past few months. In fact, in Kenya and many neighboring countries, as you mentioned, a lot of groundwater-related projects are currently ongoing, which should ideally and hopefully provide important opportunities for public participation in groundwater management, and also to enhance this percentage that you mentioned regarding the access to water there in Kenya in particular. So now for the next 15 minutes, we will have our Q&A session. So you are invited to share your questions in the Passable platform. I don't see a lot of questions. Some questions are already answered by our speakers directly there in the Passable platform. So for those who are not following it exactly, so I can give you a brief of what's happening there. So we had a question from Khatim Kharraz to Elisa regarding the reasons of the lack of knowledge in the case of Chile. And Elisa answered by saying that some studies are contradicting each other in terms of recharge capacity and also regarding the groundwater levels. And there are also some problems with the users registry, and some of those different registries are inconsistent, which also causes some challenges in this regard. Also, we had a comment from Claudia Schatz-Schneider to Elena regarding the technical and soft processes, and she also mentioned that this provides more ownership for the local community there and long-term sustainability. Let's see if we received some more questions meanwhile. So we have a new question for Jordan, Chile, and Kenya. So they are asking, Brian Bruns is asking if there are any results on aquifer water levels, and how do communities perceive goals for management. So it's an open question for three of our speakers. So if Dawood, Elisa, or Amy want to answer, you are welcome.
Yeah, I would like to answer this question. Actually, one of the most important factor of the managed aquifer recharge is the water table. And usually we consider it when we choose the site of the managed aquifer recharge, because if the water table is very deep, more than 150 meters, that means managed aquifer recharge wouldn't be very effective. But however, we have some water monitoring water wells that around the area. We are trying to get to monitor and to follow up with the records all the time. But basically, the recharge of the groundwater in an area like the site we choose in Jordan is not reflecting that fast. So it needs long time to reflect the groundwater, and it needs more projects, more managed aquifer recharge site to affect the groundwater in the short term. Specifically, we have some farms around, but there is another indicators like water quality, for example, and the moisture of the soil around the area. That's for the short term. For the long term, yes, there is an influence on the groundwater, but also it needs to be kind of a stable area, and not like Azraq, where we having lots of farm around and already overpumping problems.
I want to give my vision, because I agree with Brian regarding the relevant, like the indicator of having a good groundwater management is that the groundwater aquifer levels stop dropping, or that's like what I've seen, that people are interested on the groundwater levels. And I used to say that regarding Copiapó, I used to say it, and the aquifer started rising because it had started rising. It was down to 200 meters, and it had risen down to only 150 in some places. So it was a huge increase. However, we are now in the 13th year of the drought, and that it started dropping again. But people are acknowledging that without the communities, it would be even worse. Or that's the idea. We now don't know, but the tendency was going even worse. But the other question was, what are the indicators for the having a good groundwater management? And in the case of Copiapó, was the conflict, was being able, it's a small place, so all the kids of everybody there go to the same school, and being able to go to a school without having an urge when you see the neighbor reaching out, that was something that stopped happening once the communities were formed. They were able to, at least they could talk. They had a space where they could talk between each other. It was a safe space. That's my.
Thank you, Elisa and Dawood, for your answers. So we have also another question from Dan Bena regarding investments by government in building laboratory testing for water quality and safety. So he is also saying that in many countries, there are many regulations and books which are impressive in terms of standards and so on, but those governments lack ability to test their water to see if it fits their standards. So if one of our speakers, probably Elena, do you have an idea about this issue of investment for building water quality testing labs?
It's probably not my area of specialty. I mean, I fully agree that that has to happen. I think the one thing that just remember what Enrique also mentioned, again, that you could also introduce citizen science. I think one of the issues that we're going to have to struggle with is, on the one hand, we need to have good water monitoring, which can be expensive, but also we need to start to also have citizen science projects alongside those. So, for example, in our case, I think the water users in the case study area that we were looking at, they were also engaging in making sure that the sensors were not damaged or were protected. Yeah. So I'm bringing it again to the inclusive water governance, but I fully agree with the comment that we need investment. I think the other thing, which is not something that we've discussed in this session, but I think is going to become more important, is the standards on water quality. I think as we move into worse scenarios in a way, we're going to have to also be imaginative about water quality monitoring and standards. So, for example, in Spain at the moment, we're struggling because some of our standards are, I would even say, I'm not going to say too strict, but they don't. And it's interesting, we have a professor of water law. Sometimes regulation can also be a barrier to innovation when you're having changing circumstances. So I think this is something that we're going to have on the one hand, the investment, the knowledge, but also the regulatory framework that allows for these processes to be able to evolve as things change. That's the best answer I can give you, Michelle.
Thank you, Elena. So yeah, it was a good answer, I guess, although it's not your field, as mentioned. So I also see a new question for Jenny this time. So Naval Joshi is saying that he saw many interesting and contrasting case studies today regarding groundwater. So he is asking, what are the current pathways that the learning across countries and communities pertaining to ill effects of groundwater or positive development? So Jenny, do you have an idea about?
I wish I did. I wish I could say, yes, we have such and such a website that will definitely be able to reach also the end users in locations where there's barely any internet and barely any electricity. But we all know that is not the fact. Groundwater governance is complex. Groundwater management is very complex. Lots of these questions are very technical, besides being part of decision-making processes at different levels. So when it comes to sharing lessons learned, I think that we who are researchers or advisors or just take an interest in this and have experiences from working on the ground as well as with decision makers, we have a huge responsibility to be the ears and the eyes and share the experiences that we know of, to really sort of picture and give colors to how complex things can be on the ground. So for instance, Amy, I think you were sharing a picture of, no, it wasn't Amy, it was Elisa, who was sharing a picture of an IVRA booklet that has collected several different case studies. So that is one good way of learning about what different avenues there are and the ill effects and what can be used in different contexts. But basically, this is one of the different aspects of groundwater governance being wicked. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. So I see a new question from Khatim Kharaz, and it's addressed to Elisa or Amy, so feel free. So he is asking if the problem is mainly in those two case studies related to a general lack of interest for data collection, or is it a lack of financial means to put in place necessary equipment, or is it simply lack of resources? So Amy or Elisa.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think there's always an interest, at least in my experience. Everybody always wants to know more. So the challenges really are, I mean, sometimes they can really be physical. Some of these areas, it was really nice to have someone sort of on site, and you can see sort of the difficulties sometimes in these areas. They're hard to get to. But I think a lot of it is, financing, having the expertise and to be able to dedicate to studying these groundwater aquifers. So I think it's really more about capacity than interest. There's a clear understanding that more is more when it comes to information about groundwater, and that's really the easiest way to avoid unintended consequences. But I think particularly in developing nations, there's limited resources, and there's a lot of really important things. It's hard to oftentimes focus on research when you have such a large percentage of the population that doesn't even have access to any kind of water that would be considered sanitary, to the point that Elena was making about standards. And so you're just getting pulled in a lot of different directions. And, when it comes to, my background is hydrology. So when it comes to understanding an aquifer, it also just takes time. It really takes a long time to really be able to do the different types of data gathering that's necessary to understand both where it's flowing, how it might be recharged, and then, the surface groundwater connection, as Jenny was just talking about, is sort of sometimes the third rail. I mean, it's incredibly important, but it's one of the hardest things from a science perspective to really capture. And then you have to figure out how to regulate it. So that's my thought.
Yeah, just adding for that, I agree completely, and I did some small answer to the question on the platform, but I want to add that that part of the not the part of the resource, but the part of the capacity also has a lot to do with institutions, and that's why groundwater management, it's the more complex, because it has all these added complexities that the regular institutional system usually is not developed to capture. And the other part, not only with the capacity, is the coordination between the different institutions. In the case of the information, there are probably different institutions collecting data about the quality, for example, for one side, the flows, the snow melt, and the coordination between all those data, all those platforms, it's difficult as well. And in Chile, that's also an issue. We have a really fragmented institutional institutional system.
Thanks, Elisa and Amy again. So we still have 3 minutes, so maybe we can take 1 or 2 more questions. I see a very interesting question from Anita regarding the local participation. So all the presentations mentioned the importance of local involvement, but key locals are often busy or may not feel participation is worth their time or will have an impact on the ongoing projects or the groundwater in general. What helped overcome this challenge in your case studies? Probably could have an answer if he's still with us. Yeah, we'll have an answer for this question. As a local expert working on a project in your local area, so can you give us your opinion regarding the local involvement and the level of local involvement in your project?
Yeah, I assume this question is to me, right? Is it?
Sorry?
Yeah, can I answer the question?
Yeah. I asked you to answer this question because I felt it's for you.
The local people involvement is one of the key for the success of any project at all, for the sustainability of it, for the support of it. For example, in Azraq, lots for oasis, migration birds, fish, even salt production. So when we started that project, we tried to show them the influence or the results of this project can affect their life directly. There is some challenges to get the local people involvement in such project, But basically, if the local people don't agree or don't accept in any project, no matter what, it will not go through, because at least they will they will stop it in a way or another, or they will try. It will not be sustainable. In our case, actually, with Azraq people, because they know, they have experience about the boat situation. The situation of
Dawood, we are losing you, so probably your connection is not stable. Okay, so
them to convince the donors and other organizations.
thank you, Dawood. Sorry, we lost you on the seconds. Thanks anyway for your answer, and we will now close the Q&A session. Although there are still many interesting discussions going on the platform. So I see some discussion regarding contamination of shallow aquifers, also financial issues, and so on, water rights, etc. But for now, yeah, you can still chat there with our speakers. But before closing, it's my pleasure to invite Alice Aurélie from UNESCO IHP for the closing of this session, and to hear some of the messages that can be extracted and sent from this session to the Groundwater Summit and to the UN 2023 Water Conference. Alice, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me start repeating and highlighting that the importance of inclusive groundwater governance as a means for equitable and sustainable management of these important resources is often underestimated. And these was the main objective of this session, that wanted to raise awareness on how involvement of groundwater and aquifer users, as well as wider stakeholders engagement, can bring to reach SDG 6 and interlinked goals. We saw how stakeholders' participation is a key component of the acceleration framework leading to the UN 2023 Water Conference in New York next year. And of course, we have listened how it's important to call for improved institutional and human capacity. Well, when speaking about groundwater governance, we are looking at all the arrangements that should be established to allow for sustainable and equitable use of groundwater resources for the people and the environment. As we heard today in the session, these arrangements should be established in a collective way, as participation is a core principles of decision making, also reflected in the SDGs framework. It has a special relevance for groundwater because of its intrinsic, as has been said, characteristic of connecting all the user over the area of an aquifer. Well, in this context, we have to really learn the lessons, bottom-up approaches, or at least the complementarity of regulation by public authorities with community-based approach under co-management should be more explored. Indeed, we saw 4 examples on 4 different continents with their specificity, echoed on one of the main messages of the introductory presentation of Ms. Jenny Groundwell. To accelerate governance of groundwater resources, we must see self-regulation, community awareness building, and participatory management as complementary to governmental institutions and rules. We have listened at the case in Chile, these different other examples on the importance of managed aquifer recharge. Just last year, UNESCO has published, together with the International Association of Hydrogeologists, Commission on Managing Aquifer Recharge, and GRIP, book on 28 case studies on managing aquifer recharge. Finally, we have heard the case study of Kenya showed another modality under which expansion of WASH-focused groundwater projects can provide important opportunities for public participation in groundwater planning. At the transboundary level, the question of inclusion and participation should be also better reflected. Apparently, this is a critical, sensitive issue, as we know that the management of the transboundary aquifer is so far mainly coordinated by national authorities. This different message that we can take from the today's sessions as key for the acceleration for the achievement of the SDG 6. And of course, we should further explore in view of the UN Water Summit on groundwater that will take place the 7 and 8 December at UNESCO. In particular, the linkages with others acceleration drivers of the SDG 6 global acceleration framework. Of course, we cannot consider groundwater governance without calling for investment on groundwater governance, capacity improving capacity development to have a sound groundwater governance at national, regional, and global level. The same lack of data, we need data for groundwater governance. So the 5 accelerator, the 5 drivers of the acceleration framework are certainly linked. And what has been said today is that, of course, groundwater governance is not only looking at achievement of SDG 6, but at all the SDGs water related and not only water related. When speaking about inclusion, the gender dimension should be especially considered too. And we have to call for commitments from countries, governments, and on investment on groundwater governance at the UN 2023 Water Conference that will be organized next year in New York in March 2023. I hope that countries and donors and are listening to us, and that in our community, the experts today could generate, let's say, good partnerships and fora for passing the messages next year. I wish to conclude, and I wish to thank the partners of the today events. I want to read it again, the name of the partners: the International Water Resource Association, the Global Environment Facility, IWLearn, one of our main partners when we go in the field, supporting countries, in particular on transboundary aquifer governance, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia, the UNDP SIWI Water Governance Facility, and the United Nations Development Programme. This is a dream team, I would like to say. They are taken on board the preparation of other sessions, and in particular, they represent the core group for the next the preparation of the session on governance that will be held at the UN Water Summit in December. With this, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this very short and not, of course, comprehensive summary of this fantastic and very much interesting session. Thank you.
So thank you, Alice, for this summary. So it was indeed short, but it covered all the main topics that were mentioned. So thank you, everyone. Again, thanks our speakers, our organizers, and also mostly our audience for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi from Peru.